So welcome to today's ALA Solution Series webinar, OBBBA Explained, Understanding How the One Big Beautiful Bill Act Changes Payroll and HR Compliance for Employers. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our webinar sponsor, Asure Software. Asure is dedicated to helping organizations grow by getting the most from their people. Their mission goes beyond software. They provide the support, expertise, and resources companies need to reduce compliance risk, build stronger teams, and focus on what drives business forward. We are joined today by Mike Vannoy, the Chief Marketing Officer at Asure Software, and Mary Simmons, the Vice President, HR Compliance at Asure Software. Welcome, Mike and Mary. We're looking forward to hearing all about what you have to share with us today. And with no further ado, I'll pass it off to our presenters.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for allowing us to share some time with you today. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see it, Mike.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. Looking forward to today. 4 things that we want to talk through. I'm going to take the first 2. The first is, what is OBBBA? An overview of what the law is, what it means, and then talk about this employee tax reporting versus does it come out of the paycheck? Does it show up in the W-2? Is there a combination? What considerations do people need to make when implementing and executing this law? Then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Mary here to talk through different law firm type scenarios, different roles and overtime rules, things that I think will have real life impact for you guys, as well as some FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, in state compliance essentials for any employer that is impacted. So let me jump in first, because any employer impacted is essentially everybody with hourly employees. So the who, what, and when. The who, it's really all hourly. Technically, we'll say non-exempt. I think Mary might slap my hand for saying hourly, because it's not hourly, it's non-exempt. Employees are either exempt or they're non-exempt. And there are very specific regulations that govern these decisions. It's not our opinions whether we wanted to even someone's income out by calling them salary versus hourly. They're either exempt or non-exempt, and she's going to go deeper on that topic. It's probably the number one area that we see firms probably not taking serious enough. It's probably the number one area we see firms get in trouble, is the improper classification. And in this case, it's the downstream consequences of those classifications. So who, if you got hourly people, you got non-exempt employees, then this impacts you. So it's legal assistants, receptionists, file clerks, anybody, billing staff that is non-exempt employee paid by the hour and therefore eligible for overtime. The what? So it's a federal law. It's not a state law. It's a federal law that allows employees to exclude up to $12,500 in overtime wages from federal income. There's a tip exclusion. We won't talk about that today. I don't think that necessarily applies to your industry. It's obvious what the administration was going for here. A lot of times this law, anecdotally, was the no tax on tips and overtime law. Obviously looking for impact on frontline workers, not necessarily the corporations, but how do they help people on the front lines. So I don't think we have a lot of tipped employees, probably employers of tipped employees on this call. So we're going to focus more on the first portion, which is overtime, which certainly does tie back to hourly employees. I will say the when, interestingly, that I don't know if everybody knows it, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that's actually the name. That's the legal name. So this isn't Mary and I throwing around slang. If you go back a long time, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, was the legal name. Some people, called it Obamacare. Sometimes that might have been in complimentary, sometimes not. But just do know that we're using this term One Big Beautiful Bill Act because that is the legal name. So we'll abbreviate it and call it OBBBA. We'll probably refer to this more casually as OBBBA. But it was signed into law on July 4th, very ceremoniously, and it's retroactive. So there's a hint there in being retroactive. So how would you as an employer implement something retroactively? Well, you kind of can't and don't, and it will unpack what that means. So everybody who's got hourly employees, federal law, it's an exemption that excludes the first 12,500 of overtime wages from federal income tax. And it's legally retroactive back to July 1st of 2025 wages. Okay, here's 4 things that I think why this really matters for everybody on today's call. Number 1, there's just a lot of confusion with employees. This got a lot of press, probably way more press than the average HR law. So, as administrators of legal firms and administrative staff, we're probably used to our people knowing the basics of laws like minimum wage and overtime requirements in our state. So there's federal greater than 40 a week, but a lot of times, in New York, California, other states will have their own versions of these same laws. The employees generally know that. The employees generally don't know the inner workings of bigger federal laws like they don't understand all that's in the Fair Labor Standards Act. They don't understand all that's in FMLA. They understand maybe the concepts, but this is one that got so much press, so much attention, that I think part of Mary and I's fear, and we've seen this come up with other clients, where there's a mismatch between what the employer is legally required to do, and I'll say must do, versus the expectation of the employer. So I think if for no other reason, let's say you're in perfect compliance and doing everything right, and you understand the details of the law, great. It's probably safe to say that your employees don't. And so I think communication is a big theme you'll hear over and over here. Number 2 is just to get the wage and hour compliance right. We almost always start our engagements with clients with an HR audit, and this is probably the biggest area where we see mistakes. People misclassifications of a 1099 versus a W-2 employee, misclassifications exempt, non-exempt. There are very discrete legal definitions of what the requirements for all these things are. They aren't anybody's opinion. So it's pretty black and white, though it is complex. So that's number 2. Number 3 is you got to get this tracked accurately. I don't think it's going to be hard for folks. They've been tracking time up till now, but you got to track the eligible wages, the eligible overtime. We're going to talk a little bit about, I think there's still some ambiguity here. One of the pieces of guidance, all of the payroll software companies, so whether it's us, it's ADP, QuickBooks, we're all still waiting on some final rulings from the IRS, Department of Revenue, in Department of Labor on final guidance on things like FMLA leave. So the law calls specifically for that max of 12,500, no more. So the employees will get their return on the federal income tax portion of those wages. But what if it's a paid leave type? What if it's a different type of leave type? Does that qualify or not? There's a little bit of ambiguity. It does not. The good news today, it doesn't change any requirements for you. As an employer, there's no change in your requirements. There's a final interpretation that the payroll software companies are going to have to get right, so that the calculations are come out right, and it puts the right numbers on the right places on the W-2. The last thing is just maybe a spoiler alert for Mary here. There's a lot of state variance. This is a federal law. This is not a state law that was cloned 50 times. It's a federal law, but there are sometimes I'll call it competing interests in state laws that might seem to contradict. So there's a hierarchy here. The federal law rules, but it's not always congruent with state law. So those are the 4 big things I think everybody needs to understand coming out of here. And Mary is going to put a lot more color on that. Real quick, I just want to take you through maybe 3 examples. A lot of the early questions were about, okay, if this is no tax, no federal income tax, so again, it's federal income tax, is not state, on tips or overtime, does that mean I have to change my withholdings? And I just want to make it crystal clear, three quick slides here. The answer is no. You still must, by law, it's not a choice. You must, by law, still continue to withhold the employee's taxes. So when this thing was signed into law, it was codified under Subtitle A, Chapter 1, a bunch of blah, blah, blah that makes it apply to the 1040. It does not amend, this is real screenshots right out of the IRS website. It does not amend any of the code that would have been required to change withholdings. So why is this important? And it's not simple enough to just assume it's on the W-2, which it is. It's about getting in alignment with your employees. So if there are employees that have expectations about a paycheck changing, or just like in, say, a W-4, I could change my number of elections and therefore impact my withholdings. This is not something they get to choose. They don't get to participate and say, hey, I want to take my savings now. Can you change my W-4? Is there anything you can do in the payroll system to change it so I get my money now? I don't have to wait for the tax return. The answer is a hard no, right? Because the law does not provide any of that provision. Number two is that these are above the line deductions. So an above the line deduction is designed to impact your 1040 and your adjusted gross income. So it's just two line items. It's above the 10. It's on the 1040, and it's tips and it's overtime. And so tips is 25,000. Again, I don't think that applies to this audience probably, but it's $12,500 in overtime. And so the punchline, if in the bottom, you don't have to do anything today. You do have to track and calculate the time in the type of pay accurately so that at tax time, W-2 time for your employees, that they can file their taxes accurately and get the refund of this, the tax portion on that $12,500 in eligible wages properly. So that's punchline. And if you need any more proof, I mean, there's no way you could, as an employer, could do this even if you wanted to, right? I mean, since it comes out on the employee's tax return as a refund, not a payroll deduction, there's no way you could properly adjudicate, are they going to, is the employee going to file single versus joint? What's their spouse's total income, therefore their household income? You couldn't calculate any phase outs of them once they hit the max of the 12,500, because if they're filing jointly, I mean, there are just a million reasons why that this is obvious. So the punchline, and I got the easy part of today's job, is to give you guys the good news. Nothing you have to do today. The burden is going to be on the employee in how they file their taxes, and what shows up on their W-2 that will come from your payroll companies. If that's us, great. If it's not, we'd love to. But your payroll provider will certainly give you a compliant W-2 and give you a way to present these wages so your employees can file properly. But it's going to be on them, on the employees, to then file their return and make these claims so that they get that in their tax return. What does impact you guys a whole bunch, and all employers impacted, is making sure they're actually paying overtime properly, that they have the employees classified properly. And there's a whole bunch that goes into that. And I'll say we see mistakes every day. So with that, I'm going to give the real world implications and some of the more wonky topics over to my friend Mary.
Thanks, Mike. I don't know about wonky, but we'll see what we can do here. So what I think I view this as being, in an HR professional for my entire career, is that we want to look at laws like this and look at our HR function and say, where do I need to shore it up? What extra things do I need to put into place to make sure that I'm prepared for regulations such as this. So next slide, let me walk you through some real world examples, and hopefully this gives us some insight. And then I'm going to give you some go forward strategies to protect your organization. So what we're seeing is that some employees, are coming to their employers and saying, hey, I hear about OBBBA. It sounds like a really cool thing. I guess I'm not going to get taxed on my overtime. But when she goes to her manager's like, I'm not really sure if you're eligible for overtime. Have you worked any overtime? And really doesn't understand what the classification means. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute. So we are all on the same page here. All employees must be classified as per the Fair Labor Standards Act, exempt or non-exempt. Exempt means you're exempt from overtime. You do not get overtime. Non-exempt means you're not exempt from overtime and you get overtime. And I'll go a little bit more into the Fair Labor Standards Act, but enough to say that there is more legislation out there. And if I have any employment law firms on the call, I know you'll agree with me. There is more wage and hour claims out there than certainly anti-harassment that gets all the play in the news. It's very easy to prove, and employers tend to get it wrong. So what are some of the risks to an organization where the employee and the manager don't know that the position that that employee has is exempt and that they're not eligible for overtime? So the first line of defense here is to create a job description for every position within the organization. Now, if you have 5 paralegals, you don't need 5 different job descriptions unless you maybe have a senior and a junior paralegal, for example. But we do want a job description for every position. Why? Because this is our defense if we were called into a court of law. If Jane decided, instead of going to her manager or instead of trusting her manager that she's not eligible for overtime, if she decided to go to the Department of Labor and say, hey, I haven't been paid overtime, and it triggers a lawsuit, an investigation, excuse me, that investigation, maybe it uncovers that Jane truly is an exempt employee. But without a job description, it's going to be tough to defend that exemption, that classification within a court of law. And number 2, you never want the Department of Labor knocking on your door, right? We know what auditors are looking for. They are looking for mistakes. So if it's not this mistake, maybe there's something else that innocently our organization is doing incorrectly. And when we do things incorrectly, these audits lead to fines. And I can tell you from experience, because we assist our clients with these audits, those fines can be very, very damaging to an organization. So next slide, please. What are we going to do what are some proactive measures that we can take here? So first of all, your managers need to be educated on basic HR strategies, functions, etc. So one of the things that I would suggest that we do with our clients, we do a training called HR 101. I am not training the managers to be an HR nerd like myself. I'm training the managers so they have a baseline of information, so they know that all of their employees are either exempt or non-exempt. So they have access to the job descriptions, which, by the way, will help them with performance management as well. And they understand when an employee comes to them and asks them a question like, how come I don't get overtime? They understand that that particular employee is exempt, or for that matter, non-exempt. We also need to educate employees. Best practice is to provide a job description to new hires as part of their orientation, right? So when we're conducting orientations and onboarding for clients, there is a huge compliance piece. I see some friends from New York are on the call. We know we have some particular nuances, as does, I saw somebody joined that's also from California. We tend to be the toughest as far as employment law goes, but job description is a best practice for everybody on the call. They need to be updated every year. And I would say listen, COVID is a distant memory, right? But maybe that changed the workforce for good for a lot of us. Maybe people are now remote 1 day a week or 2 days a week where they weren't before COVID. That is certainly something we should be reflecting in a job description besides the classification of exempt or non-exempt. So let's do another example on the next slide, just to try and drive home sort of what we're looking at. So in this example, a non-exempt employee, so this is an employee that is not exempt from overtime, meaning they can earn overtime, thinks their overtime should not be taxed in 2025. So Ron is very upset. He hears about OBBBA, he gets his paycheck, and he's, really excited for the weekend to spend this bigger paycheck that he thinks he's going to get because he works consistent overtime, and now he thinks because it's not taxed, his paycheck is going to be larger. He, of course, goes to his manager, who's also confused, and they consult with HR to understand the law. Ron is so mad that his paycheck isn't bigger, that he wants to quit, which again, is not an outcome that any of us want. It's still difficult right now to find good talent. We don't want them quitting because we didn't communicate properly how this new law may affect them. So some of the risks here, again, an employee quits, they also could go to the Department of Labor, right? And that could lead to that wage and hour audit, right? So the Fair Labor Standards Act, also called wage and hour law, these fines are very big, or can be very big. And once they start digging, they're not gonna stop. And maybe we come back for another session and we just do the whole session on wage and hour law, because I could go on and on and on because there are so many nuances to it. For OBBBA, we're really here looking at overtime, right? We're making sure that our managers are educated that for most employers, we cannot give comp time instead of overtime, right? So we also want to make sure, listen, I'm sure most companies are like telling their managers, be really careful not to give overtime. We can't afford that extra expense. And then Ron's manager is like, oh no, Ron worked overtime. Hey, Ron, instead of me giving you overtime this week, why don't you take Monday off? Or, whatever, offers him comp time. That is clear violation of wage and hour law, right? So again, I go back to educating the manager as well as the employee. So on the next slide, let's look at some proactive measures we can take from this example, which is to conduct a wage and hour audit, right? So this audit should be reviewed clearly. You're going to pull some reports out of your payroll system. And what I'm looking for is not just the overtime, right? I'm looking for consistency. So number one, when I look down the run of employees and whether or not they're exempt or non-exempt, I want to make sure that in similar positions, the classification is the same, right? If I have two paralegals doing exactly the same job and one's exempt and one is non-exempt, I can tell you, an auditor is really going to find exception with that. That's definitely going to be an issue, right? So again, I go to ensuring managers are trained in wage policies, right? Do your managers understand when overtime is triggered, right? So my friends in California, hopefully you know that in California, it's over 8 hours in the day. For most of the rest of us, there are some other states that have some nuances, but for most of the other states and for federal law, the overtime's going to be triggered over 40 hours in a week for our non-exempt employees. So understanding that the managers, even if you tell somebody you can't work overtime, Mike, I'm not allowing it. If Mike works overtime, we must pay him. You can take disciplinary action against Mike, but you have to pay him that overtime that he already worked. And to this end, I think the last point that I have here is very, very important. Your employee handbook, another HR document that should be looked at multiple times a year, certainly once a year, like the job descriptions, should have a very clear overtime policy, right? How do your employees sign in? How do they get approval for overtime? When is overtime paid, right? All of those policies need to be looked at every year, right? Because when I'm creating a handbook for a client, the first thing I look at is federal law, the next thing is state law. And I know that, I have legal professionals on the call, so I'm sure you understand this. And Mike talked about the nuance between state and federal law. Don't forget, now we have municipalities jumping into it, right? So my New York friends, you know that Westchester County, Long Island, and New York City can be different. I had a couple friends in upstate New York. We tend to be different in a few different laws, certainly minimum wage, than upstate New York. California, I can tell you, the municipalities are broken down even more minutely. So we have to look not only at federal and state law, but municipal law, and whatever is better is what the employee gets. Whatever of those laws benefits the employee best. And I would say minimum wage is my best example of that, right? So minimum wage federally is still at $7.25 an hour, which my California and New York friends, you're probably like, what? Because we're double and triple that in a lot of areas. And then a lot of the other states on the call, you're following federal minimum wage. So policies in the handbook have to be looked at every year because things change that fast. But I would also say that your internal policies might change that fast as well. And we need to make sure that they are very clear in our handbook. And again, it's not good enough just to update the handbook. When we update a policy, we always send it out for e-signature so that the employees understand it. And a best practice would be to go over that policy with your managers, who are your frontline people working with the employees, to make sure they understand any changes you've done. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right, so OBBBA is a trigger event. So what I mean by that is it's kind of shining a light, not kind of, it is shining a light on our HR function, right? And different policies. So number one, just to reiterate what Mike said, we need to maintain standard withholding of federal income tax. We need to make sure that we're tracking tips and overtime. And we need to communicate with your employees, right? You don't want a mistake like in the scenario with the employee Ron, who was like, yay, my paycheck's going to be bigger because there's no taxes out of my overtime. let's get ahead of that. Let's communicate with our employees clearly and concisely. And it can be through your managers. It can be through your payroll systems. Most payroll systems will allow you to email communication to all of your employees. However you do it, a town hall. We've done all of the above for our clients. And I suggest that you get ahead of it, right? The employees are confused. Confusion is usually not a good thing to have in the workforce, right? So on the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about what steps that we want to take. So first and foremost, as I said before, every employee. So remember, we could have a worker as part of our workforce, and that might be a 1099. They are not an employee. Our employees have to be exempt or non-exempt. And like Mike said, you know, one of the first things we do with our clients is an HR assessment. And that usually leads to an FLSA audit, because I'll say, just curious, you have two secretaries, same job description, one's exempt, one's non-exempt. Can you tell me why? And they'll say, well, Jane wanted to be exempt and Sam wanted to be non-exempt. And hopefully some people are chuckling or understand that that is not the employee or the employer's choice. Exemptions, classifications are driven by a duties and a salary test that is pretty clear cut, right? There's some gray areas that, we're often helping employers with, but everybody needs to be exempt from overtime or non-exempt classifications. So first and foremost, next thing that I want everybody to think about is that employee handbook, please. So interestingly enough, an employee handbook is not mandated by the federal law or any states, not even for my friends in California. That being said, there are many policies in many states that we have to give to our employees in their hands, right? So I'm hoping everybody knows that you have to have employment posters, federal, state, and local, posted where employees can see it. Some states have even now mandated electronic posters. Thank you, New York. But we also should, as a best practice, have a handbook. Look, the handbook is going to save you time and it's going to save you money, because when it comes to having a nice, clear overtime policy, right? You don't want employees just taking overtime just so that they have a bigger paycheck. And now OBBBA will allow even more in their pay because they won't be taxed on part of that overtime. We want to control our overhead to the extent we can. So that policy in the handbook, triggered by OBBBA, needs to be very clear cut. We do this all day, every day. Everything in a handbook needs to be customized, again, to your state, to the federal government, to your municipality, but more importantly, to the nuances of your organization. Even though they're all law firms on this call, every one of you has a different culture, and these policies need to reflect that to be effective. So the next slide, we'll talk about another piece of this checklist, which is the job description. So I hopefully have made my case for why job descriptions are also, in my mind, a document that has to be created. Again, not mandatory by any state or federal law, but I would tell you that this is a document that when I'm doing employee relations with an employer, when I'm helping them figure out whether an employee is eligible for the Americans with Disabilities Act, hiring people, interview questions, and their classification, all of the above, I'm using a job description. But remember that job description, consult with professionals. It needs to be something that can help you defend that classification. But it also needs to be clear and concise because it should be shared with the manager and the employees so that they can understand it. Next slide, please. So the next piece, of course, is our timekeeping practices. So this is really important, right? And I added here that I also want to make sure that your timekeeping is also tracking breaks and meal periods, right? And so I'm just going to take a little divergence here for a second because I'd be remiss not to, because I just see this mistake so often with the employers that we support, which is where we want employees to take breaks, where it's mandatory. Number one, if you are automatically taking a half hour of unpaid time from your non-exempt employees through your timekeeping policy, and let's just say that it's one of you on the call and you're sitting at your desk eating your lunch and you're consistently picking up the phone and working during that lunch and you're non-exempt, that is paid time. So again, very important. We need to educate our managers and we need to educate our employees, and we need to make sure that our employee handbook has very clear and concise timekeeping practices and policies, but also how are we tracking? What are we tracking? And the overtime, of course, is the most important. Listen, I would also add here that for example, I had an employer that said they had quite a few people taking the bus to work, and the bus arrived 20 minutes before the 9 a.m. shift. So everybody would clock in at 20 of 9 and promptly sit down and have their coffee and donut, right? So that's another thing that we need to educate our employees. You clock in and you go to work. You don't clock in and then sit and have your breakfast or your lunch or whatever it is. So super important to have these clear and concise and company-driven, organizationally driven policies. Next slide, please. So unauthorized overtime. I went over this a little bit and I want to just, reiterate, because again, these are best practices and I'm trying to share with you what I see out there. We have, north of, 100,000 clients we're helping all the time with these issues. And this is a common one, right? I didn't authorize the overtime, so I didn't pay it. As I said before, that's going to trigger a wage and hour claim if that employee knows their rights and goes to a legislative body, governing body that's going to come and do an audit. Right. And so we need them to understand how to get that approval, how to sign in, and the managers need to understand how to manage that overtime, right? If they worked it, pay it, but we can use disciplinary action. So no, I'm repeating myself, but I just see that over and over again as an issue. Next slide. So training your managers. I think I've said this quite a few times, and I'm going to say it again. Not only on the overtime, but our managers are the ones that are working with employees day in and day out. So that manager training, and again, HR 101 is only one of the trainings that we do. Certainly, other areas where compliance is going to come into play here, not necessarily triggered by OBBBA, but it's, interviewing, right? So from hire to retire, we need to be focused on compliance within our organization. That's what's going to save us time, save us money, and just make generally a better workplace for everybody involved. But when it comes to OBBBA, we want to make sure that the managers understand what is the law, how does it affect our organization, how does it affect our employees. So very important that managers understand the basics of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And of course, because OBBBA is so prevalent right now and important, that they understand the basics of OBBBA. Next slide, please. So I think one of the other things that I want everybody to be aware of, and thank you so much. I see a lot of you shared your location. It's great to see everybody from all over the country. That overtime laws and local regulations are going to vary. One thing I would obviously make everybody aware of is that there probably is, I think at last count, about 15 to 20 areas that minimum wage is going to go up in 2026. A lot of states choose January 1 as the date. So make sure that you look at that. Very, very, very important. Next slide, please. So I did want to spend a minute on white collar exemptions, right? And the reason that this again is so important is because if we're going to classify somebody as an exemption, they have to fit into one of the exemptions denoted by the Department of Labor, and the most common are the white collar exemptions. So these white collar exemptions are the executive exemption, administrative, and professional. So the attorneys that we work with are going to fall under the professional exemption. Executive exemption is for managers that manage 2 or more individuals on a consistent basis. Now, I'm going to give you a great example where this can get you into a little bit of trouble. So big case law against Home Depot a few years ago because they were just made a blanket decision. Everybody who manages 2 or more people, not really digging into the executive exemption, you manage 2 or more people, you're exempt. And there was a big lawsuit because what was happening is, I'm sure most of you have shopped at a Home Depot, right? The manager is managing 2 or more people, but they're doing menial, non-exempt tasks, stocking shelves, helping employees, may even, help the cashiers from time to time, sweep the floor, etc., which broke their exemption. And many of those managers were misclassified as exempt and were truly non-exempt. So on the face, these all look very simple. The administrative exemption, I find my employers that we support definitely have the most issue with. And I think that word administrative is what is confusing. So the last phrase there is probably the most important. So exercises independent judgment on significant matters. And what I've found with a lot of employers is they say, yeah, well, I'm going to make them exempt because they get to order all the office supplies, and that's significant. That's probably not going to pass muster if that's the only thing they do, the individual does as a using independent judgment. Significant matters is the verbiage that you really want to focus on there, because what it really means is, are the decisions that the individual is making, so this would be an HR director, is the decisions that they're making affecting the bottom line of the business? And there's a lot that goes into this, and this is where we sort of get into that gray area. But that, becomes a little confusing, I find, when I'm explaining it to employers. The professional exemption, a little easier. Learned professionals, I'd say creative professionals gets into a little gray areas as well. One of my daughters is a graphic designer, not falling under the creative professional. She's non-exempt. My son, on the other hand, is a UX designer. He is exempt, right? And you really need to look at both job descriptions to see the difference. But one creates original work, one is really the graphic designer is doing whatever she's told. Maybe she changes the color, the blues. But if they want it blue, maybe she does a brighter blue or a darker blue, but for the most part, she's following direction. I'd say when it comes to exemptions, one of the biggest confusion is that we all understand that non-exempt hourly workers are paid minimum wage, whatever's better, the federal, the state, or the local minimum wage they get, okay? Everybody I feel that I talk to understands that. But when it comes to exempt employees, they have to meet the duties test, which, is, I generalized here, gave a short summary here. But they also have to pass the salary test. So federally, every exempt employee minimally has to make $684 a week. Okay. But in many, many, many states, of course, including New York and California, but Washington, Massachusetts, that salary minimum for an exempt employee is higher than the federal, much higher, twice as much in many areas. So again, hourly workers, they have to get minimum wage, whatever's the best, state, federal, or local. Exempt employees must get a minimum of $684 unless their state or local salary threshold minimum for an exempt employee is higher than $684, then they get that. Pretty confusing, and I know a lot of my employers get it wrong, but when it comes to OBBBA, we got to get these classifications right. Next slide, please. I think we're at the end. And I did see some questions in the chat. How do we want to address those?
Hey, Mary. So we have one question, and the first one is, will notation of overtime eligibility and job offers also help?
Yes, it will. A couple of nuances I want everybody to think about there. So when it comes to an offer letter, please, 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 I've had a couple, employers get sued for this. Please don't send an offer letter that says, you're going to make $100,000 a year. I can't wait for you to stay forever. Right? So number one, you fire them 2 weeks later. I've seen case law where they say, you said I'd stay forever, and you said I'd get $100,000 a year. Give me the 100,000 and I'll go bye-bye. So that's number one. In that offer letter, if you're stating whether they're exempt or non-exempt, that will help. But how are you defending that? You need the job description to defend it. And I just want to add, for my New York and California employers, we have the Wage Theft Act, which is a form, LS-54, LS-55, et cetera, that has to be given at new hire during their onboarding, that does state whether they're exempt or non-exempt. So a little more information than you asked for, but I hope that helps.
Our next question is there a template yet of communication to employees and staff regarding the new law?
There is not. That is definitely something that we create customized for each of our employers. Because again, you really want to infuse culture so that it fits the audience that you're sending it to. But nothing's come out of the out of the federal government. I would say that they had stated that beginning of October, middle of October, there'd be some more information about OBBA, and they did send a little bit, but because of the government shutdown, they haven't, there's still more information to come out about OBBA. Whether that would be included or not, I'm not certain. I haven't seen it in the proposals.
And Mary, I don't even anticipate it at the federal level to be a template. I think one of the big areas of confusion amongst employers and employees is this overlap of paid leave types. You know, some states have paid FMLA. If it's unpaid, it's a non-issue. But you know, if you're an employee who maybe the employee takes, say, 2 days of paid leave of some type or not. Maybe it's a state mandate, maybe just something you offer as an employer, but then they have another 30 hours of work. The Fair Labor Standards Act would only recognize the actual worked hours, but that employee might have an expectation that, well, I had 20 hours of paid leave, but another 30, so 10 of that would be overtime. That's just a super superficial example that it just so nuanced state by state, municipality by municipality, that I would just set expectations that there is not a template forthcoming from the federal government.
Got it. Our next question is, I understand there are occupation codes that will need to be reported along with qualified tips, but are there also occupation codes that need to be reported alongside qualified overtime?
I haven't seen that, and I don't think that's going to come out either. Yeah, all I saw was a preliminary list of codes for overtime, and they didn't even finalize that. They kind of threw it out there and said, "This is what we think it'll be." I don't see much change happening there, but I don't think they're going to have anything.
Yeah, they're definitely treating that they've guided that 2025 is a quote unquote transition year, which is not terribly helpful for all of us on the call here. That I think that, but they have also published a draft of a 2026 W-2 that has some suggestions for what those codes may be for tips versus overtime I think that's for the qualified tips, the qualified overtime pay, but they're simply draft format. I think the best guidance we would give would be just to keep really good records. I don't think there's the change. It's too late for a change to the 2025 W-2. And so keep as good records as you can and provide those records to your employees so that they can make that claim, that above the line deduction on their tax returns to get to get this tax credit, but do so in a way that you're covering your other end for the auditability and theirs at the same time. I think where the government shutdown sure as heck didn't help us. I think we need more guidance, but I think we're middle of November, so this thing passed July 4th. We're a lot of the way through the year without complete clarity. Just err on the side of documentation. So in the same way an employee might make a deduction on the square footage of their home and what percent of that is a home office, well, the employer doesn't provide that. That's something that they just have to provide the documentation that justifies the backing for that. So I think that's how we should be thinking about this.
Great. So another question is, paralegals were used as an early example of non-exempt by the IRS. Is that still the best practice? Because a number of firms still list them as exempt.
Mary, you want to take that on paralegals?
Yeah, I would have to see a job description. I caution anybody to say this position is always exempt or non-exempt, because they can look so different in different organizations. I used an HR manager as an example earlier as being exempt. That being said, I work with HR managers who are really only that in title. So exemptions, again, they're not driven by title, they're driven by job responsibilities. Remember the duties and the salary test. So I would need to know a job description and I would need to know a salary of a position to really make that. You really can't make a blanket statement. We try never to say never and never to say always in HR. Good question, though.
Mary, if it is safe to say that generally speaking, like you might see the word paralegal in an IRS FAQ, but you'll never see it as a requirement in a test for Fair Labor Standards Act. That's always going to be either the salary or duties test. There's only two tests, duties and salary.
Correct.
Our next question is, hypothetically speaking, if we want to give 35K plus, if we want to give a 35K plus raise to a non-exempt paralegal and also change their position to exempt, how would we handle that?
I mean, you certainly can do that. No problem. That sounds like an amazing increase. If you're in New York or California, you would give a new wage theft form, those LS forms. There's, probably 25 of them in 15 different languages. So you'd have to find the appropriate one because you're changing status. And much like you give an offer letter, I think a best practice is we give a change of status form to the employee, congratulating them for the promotion, et cetera. And you really need to explain to them that they're exempt now instead of non-exempt. That can be a major change for somebody.
Our next question is, it is my understanding that W-2 for 2005 will not be modified for this overtime reporting, and that employers have to provide an additional form to employees and file something with the IRS. How are employers required to report that information on overtime to the IRS?
And I think I hit that one earlier. I did notice that question. There's no, as far as we know, there isn't going to be, there certainly isn't yet. And I can't imagine, knowing that it's halfway through November, that there's going to be a change in the 2025 W-2. We've seen draft of 2026 W-2 that will likely have a new two sub boxes under box 14 that will call for qualified overtime and qualified tips. But as of right now, they're calling it "quote unquote" a transition year, and without the specificity of what the documentation required. So I would just err on the side of tracking it, presumably through a time and attendance system or spreadsheets or however you're doing it, but keep excellent records and keep audit trail of that you are then providing that documentation to your employee at the end of the year, approximately the time they get their W-2, so that they can properly get that deduction on that above the line deduction on their tax return. Mary,
Great.
anything you?
I agree with you 100%. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that you said it perfectly, Mike.
No.
Of course.
Our next question is, how would you recommend communicating the change to an exempt employee who should have been a non-exempt employee?
Oh, now that's a tough one. So if you really think about it accurately, so we're kind of at year end, right? So we're in the middle of November. If you do an FLSA audit and you go, uh-oh, Mike was exempt, but he should have been non-exempt. The correct way to do it is to look at your timekeeping, and if they worked any overtime, they should receive that as a payment. Back pay. Now, what a lot of you are going to say to me is, Mary, we don't record time for our exempt employees and I had Mike classified as exempt. So that tends to be the quandary with my clients where we do this, and we do it often, we do it a lot. So you really got to look at the situation. Number one, did Mike work overtime in 2025? And if he was employed for a couple of years, did he work overtime the years prior to that? In theory, Mike is due all of that money. If they came in and did a wage and hour audit, you would need to give him that back pay. So you need to make a decision about what you're going to do there. And then, you also want to look at, were you paying him the correct salary as an exempt employee? If you're switching him to non-exempt, what's going to be the base pay? And what will that overtime be? You can just sit down with Mike and say, Mike, we had you as exempt. Good news. Now, when you work over 40 hours with approval, you'll earn overtime. Your overtime rate is X. Your hourly rate is $10 an hour. Your overtime rate is $15 an hour. I will tell you from past experience, doing this hundreds of times, employees see it as a negative to go from exempt to non-exempt. They think it's sort of a lower position. So it takes a lot of it takes a lot of professionalism to craft a communication and sit down and have that conversation. I would definitely consult with professionals on that. It's a great question.
Well, guys, we're at time. Are there any final thoughts you would love to leave the audience with before we close out?
I would just say, I know it was a lot of information. I hope it's clear when you get the deck, but we'll make ourselves available for further questions, additional questions as you dig in and look at your organization. I would say not a lot to do with OBBBA, except that it shines the light on your HR function being compliant, especially FLSA.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
couldn't say better. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your presentation. We are now at time, and this now concludes our webinar today. Would you guys like to leave the audience members with any contact information on how to reach out to you guys if they have any questions?
Easiest way is AsureSoftware.com, and go to the top right and click a box to let us get in contact with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much, and thank you all for attending, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.